Well, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Good morning. It's been several weeks since we've been able to come together and discuss the parasha for this week. So I'm happy to be here and be able to do that. As you may remember, since it's been a little while, the Torah is divided into different portions so that within a given year, we're able to read through and discuss all 5 books of Moses. Generally during the high holidays, which we just had, so Shavuot, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, we kind of take a break from going through the Torah. We focus on some other passages, but this morning we are resuming. So the good news is that we get to resume our walk through Deuteronomy together. The potentially sad news, however, is that this morning we will be discussing the very last parasha in the book of Deuteronomy. So this is kind of like landing the plane. In Jewish tradition, when you complete the Torah cycle, it's called Simchat Torah, which is the joy of the Torah. And usually in synagogues, they're going to take the Torah, they're going to bring it around, people are going to be dancing, they're going to be celebrating, it's a good time. But next week, they start all over again. Next week it starts with Genesis 1, and then they go through the cycle once again. However, Simchat Torah is a good time to also pause and to reflect. We just read through all this revelation from God. It's a good time to think, what has stood out to us? What have we learned? How are we being shaped by God's word? And if there's nothing, then it's a good thing to reflect more consistently. How is God's word shaping me? And that's what Simchat Torah provides for our opportunity. Now, in our parasha this morning, we're actually going to see some of this life reflection from Moses, because in this last section, we hear the final words of Moses. You know, we often like people's final words. If you hear like these are the final words of an inventor or the final words of a philosopher, it carries a lot of weight. It's kind of like their main points, their main priorities. Well, what were the final words of Moses? What was the main point that he wanted Israel to remember? Here we're going to see some insight into the mind of Moses. So our parasha this morning is called וזאת HAB'RACHA, meaning this is the blessing. And in Deuteronomy 33, Moses gives his final blessing over the entire nation of Israel. He actually specifies each tribe. One is missing. If you're wondering which one, that'll be your homework for this week. Come next week and tell me which tribe is missing. I'll be very impressed. But he gives a blessing almost over every tribe. And while we can't go through each one and go through all the details, we really see 2 main things that he focuses on. His 2 main kind of last emphases. The first, he reminds them of their responsibility as a nation to remain faithful to God. In his first blessing over Reuben, which is the firstborn, it really kind of encapsulates the entire Torah. He says, may Reuben live and not die. In other words, remember those 2 paths that Moses often laid out, that if you do good, you'll be blessed. If you do bad, you will be cursed. He's saying, do well, remain in obedience to God, be blessed. Otherwise, there will be judgment. Moses reminds Israel of their responsibility to care for their spiritual lives and to reflect on how to live obediently to God. That's the first thing, their responsibility. Then Moses shifts to the revelation of God. And here he focuses on who God is, how he has revealed himself, and the character of God. Why? Because the reason you and I are called to follow God, the reason we're supposed to be obedient is not because of fear of a certain judgment that's coming, but it's supposed to grow out of a heart of faithfulness and love for who God is. That's the motivation that draws us to him. And so Moses says, the eternal God is a dwelling place. That's where you want to go. The eternal God is a dwelling place, and underneath are the everlasting arms of protection. That's where you want to be. And so he points them to the source that will sustain them as they enter into the land. So those are the final words of Moses, those 2 emphases in Deuteronomy 33. Then we go to chapter 34, the last chapter of the entire Torah. This recounts Moses' death. If you remember, Moses, because of a time of disobedience, he wasn't allowed to enter into Canaan. So he brings Israel to Moab, and he says, God, please reverse the curse, reverse the judgment. And God says no. So he wasn't allowed to enter. But what did God do? He took him to Mount Nebo. He took him to a high mountain outside of the land, and he said, you can't go in, but you could look. and you could witness the land. And God says to him, "This is the land that I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give this to your descendants. I have set it before your eyes, Moses, but you shall never go in." And that's a really bittersweet moment. On the one hand, you have God's faithfulness. This is the land that I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is the promise, and I have fulfilled it. That shows that God is a faithful God. On the other hand, in the example of Moses, you see that consequences, or that sins have long-standing consequences. And that's why we always need to be careful in how we live. So after seeing the land, Moses, in Deuteronomy 34, he passes away. And Joshua takes the mantle and he begins to lead the nation of Israel as you read on into the text. But before we close, I want to point out one interesting concept here. When speaking about Moses' death, it says, "And he, God, buried Moses in the valley of the land of Moab, but no man knows his burial place to this day." Why not? In Israel's history, many times they would put a landmark for something that happened, whether God revealed himself somewhere, whether there was a covenant that was made, whether laws were given. We know where Miriam was buried. We know where Aaron was buried. Why this mystery around where Moses was buried? Why couldn't we know? We're not sure. On the one hand, this may have been a protective measure. Maybe God wanted to prevent the people from making a shrine. Oh, this is where Moses was buried. Let's set up a place of worship here that might lead them into idolatry. But on the other hand, as we're coming to the end of the Torah, I think the purpose of this is to direct our attention appropriately, not to focus on where Moses was buried, but to focus on the one whom Moses pointed to. Because you see, when you come to the end of Deuteronomy, the entire book doesn't end with sadness and mourning, but it ends with a messianic hope. As the book closes, it says, since the time of Moses, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, who the Lord knew face to face. Now, if that doesn't ring some bells, perhaps do a little study on Messianic prophecy, because that's a very important line. Because all the way in Numbers, when Moses was challenged about his prophetic status, God came down and he said, listen, Moses is in a category all on his own. He's not like any of the other prophets. Why? Because I speak with him face to face, directly, not in visions, not in dreams. And then in the book of Deuteronomy, when Moses is prophesying, he says, listen, in the future, God's going to raise up a prophet like me, a prophet like Moses, who is going to convey God's words absolutely clearly. And then finally, at the end of Deuteronomy, we see there's still that messianic hope. Who is that prophet like Moses looking forward? And so this hope is the legacy of Moses. And this is the best legacy to have. Not focused on necessarily where they're buried, commemorating their life is important, but rather, who was the one that they pointed to? And that's the legacy that we want to leave as well. When people remember you, the best thing would be that they remember the one who you represented, and they remember the one who you pointed to, who is the Messiah. So as we stand and we sing this morning, we celebrate Simchat Torah, we celebrate God's revelation, of course, beyond the Torah, into the prophets, the writings, and of course the New Testament. Let us strive to have that legacy like Moses, who always sought to point people to obedience to God, sought to point them to the Messiah in heaven, and to run the race faithfully before the Lord. Shabbat Shalom.